Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really grateful for this opportunity. I'm happy always to come back to Los Angeles and especially to LMU for at least 4 reasons. First, I am the product of Jesuit education. I studied in Jesuit schools all the way up to college, and that was a very important experience for me. I think in many ways I acquired my commitment and understood the challenges of oppression and inequity through the education I received in Jesuit schools. In addition, 31 years ago, I started my career at UCLA. Shortly after I finished my Ph.D., this was my first academic appointment. So I came to LA a few months after the Rodney King beating and the uprising and a lot of other things that were happening at the time in Los Angeles. It was a time of fear and excitement, of change, of hope. And I started my work looking at the intersection of race and disability at the time, at a moment in which the field was not necessarily interested in engaging those questions. I remember many discussions I had in conferences, and it was unfortunate that at the time, given the evidence that had accumulated over the generations, and despite all the events happening around the city and the country, we did not have the investment and the commitment to understand these issues. Now, I'm looking at the problem of why so many students of color end up in programs for students with special needs. Not because that's wrong, not because students of color may not need specialized interventions, but when you look at the rates of placement of these students. So despite the prevalence of these disparities, we continue to grapple with this problem. There have been at least 2 National Academy of Sciences reports looking at this. We have grappled with this since the 1960s. And the research did not start to accumulate until the year 2000. So it's only 20 years of research studies that we have in front of us. What I would like to do today is to engage with an intersection, as Superintendent Carvalho alluded to, between ability differences and language. And by the way, I appreciate all of the support that I've received from LMU and from LAUSD to make this happen, particularly the invitation from my good friend and colleague, Chris Cormier. Of course, Magali Lavadens also was involved in this, and the LAUSD team was incredibly supportive in getting ready for this. Angela Sandoval and her team were very instrumental in making sure that I was here, so I want to stop for a moment to acknowledge them for all the support that went into preparing for today. What I would like to do is to share with you a set of provocations to bring attention to the intersection of language and disability. We have known a great deal about this issue of race and disability, but there are interesting, fascinating developments around language that have been under the surface. When we look at the data of racial disparities in special education, English language learners or dual language learners or multilingual learners do not show up as being disproportionately placed. That is a misleading trend because we're seeing at the aggregate of scores of placement around states and districts. That may be the case at the national level, but when you go down to the state or the district level, you find very different patterns of placement in special education. And that is part of the message that I want to bring to you today, that we need to understand the local histories and the local circumstances in which students, dual language learners, are educated. In part because we're changing our assumptions about language, and I will say a little bit more about that in a moment, particularly the idea of racializing language and the emergence of discourses around the idea of racial linguistics and how that has implications for students who might speak English in non-standard ways. Now, building on Superintendent Carvalho's statement about accents and speaking multiple languages, I remember a comment from Edward James Olmos when he was addressing a group of preschoolers who were all immigrant kids. And he said to them, don't ever be ashamed of having an accent. The only thing that an accent says about you is that you speak more than one language. And what a wonderful thing to have in your life. Nevertheless, there are very specific stances and policies as reflected as in terms as the Office of English Language Acquisition that sends messages about who belongs and who is a full member of our society. So we need to bring a critical perspective to the discussion about language and disability. So as I will engage with these ideas, I want to acknowledge we know a lot about second language and about special education. That intersection of the two markers of difference is to some extent uncharted territory for different reasons. But we still have some technical knowledge. And beyond rehashing the list of the strategies we know, I'm going to actually broaden that scope and challenge you to think about how else do we frame the question what we tend to see in journals and in school districts. That question is this child struggling because he or she is learning English or because there is a learning disability or a speech impairment? We hear that a lot. What do we do? Do we refer or do we wait? If we wait, are we wasting time? Are we depriving them of interventions they might benefit from? When do we do it? When is the right time? Are we making a mistake? What is that going to do to the numbers in the district for disparities and the citations we might get if we get too many students in special ed? So those are some of the things that are circling around this discussion. And instead of subscribing to that perspective, what I would like to do is to raise questions and show evidence that will challenge us to think, can we broaden that framing? Can we think about other considerations beyond whether it's a language limitation or a disability? And I think we have enough evidence to say we have the wrong lens and we need to start working. And many of you are already doing some of that work. So I look forward to the discussion. So I'm going to do three things. I'm going to contextualize the discussion by giving some background information. Then I will share with you some of this evidence that I call intriguing because they force us to face complexity. In a world that pushes us to subscribe to short statements and slogans and easy truth, I'm arguing human life is not about that. This is about complexity and richness of cultures and languages. So we're going to review that, and then I'll discuss briefly some implications of this work.